What? Bam! We're back at it again. It's your boy, Spooky Software. Software Spooky. Am I on the list? Yes, I'm on the list. Check the list. I'm on there. How's it going, everybody? I hope you're doing well. It's a beautiful weekend here in the Netherlands, but I am really excited about today's video. This is something that I actually care pretty deeply about. And I'm happy to see that there's actually more and more content available on the web than there ever has been. But I just wanted to throw in my 2 cents on this stuff. I just wanted to give a little bit of context, some things that I see that are missing from other resources that are out there. Today, we're going to be, of course, talking about accessibility, software accessibility in particular. You may have seen this abbreviated online as A11Y, or just maybe Ally, as I pronounce it. And so really, this is a conceptual idea that you can apply to almost really anything. But in particular, software, if we're engineers, we're practicing accessibility and prioritizing accessibility. What does that mean? What are we doing there? How do I do it? If I believe you that this is important, what do I do? And so let's kind of delve into that a little bit right away. So accessibility is, in my view, something we should all be thinking about, right? When we produce software and we give it to users to use, there's a certain degree to which it is available to the users who have access to it, right? And so what I mean by that is things like, we're going to be talking about the web primarily today because I think that's a very popular way to produce software, but certainly this applies to any kind of software, really. When you make something a website, you're actually committing to through whether consciously or unconsciously, you might be forgetting about certain classifications of users if you're not careful, right? So, accessibility is about how our code communicates with its user. It's about inclusivity. It's about there's an author who writes a lot about accessibility, especially on the web. His name is Heydon Pickering. He calls accessibility sort of a way to is a way to talk about the accommodation that software provides. And I really like that. Who are you accommodating with your software? I think is a really important question. And, software engineers and, business people, product managers, designers are certainly used to that kind of idea, especially when you're talking about business, like, what kinds of users and use cases and customers do we have? But it can be more than that, right? It can be about not forgetting about certain kinds of individuals, right? And, I want to come back to this because, a lot of the resources on the web really start to go really hard into accessibility, and they start talking about ARIA attributes. If you've heard of this ARIA, A-R-I-A, this is a specification for working with certain kinds of, for instance, screen reader software. And these are important things, and these are certainly part of accessibility, but actually accessibility is so much more than that. And this is just like one of the kinds of users that you can sort of accommodate, right? I also want to, kind of point out that accessibility is not just ARIA attributes, but it's also not really a checklist, right? And I feel as though a lot of the content out there, talks about, make sure you have these certain ARIA attributes, which is, a good thing to do. But that implies that accessibility is a checklist, and you either have these things or you don't. And if you do, you're accessible, and if you don't, you're not. And that's certainly not the case at all. So again, this is kind of about equity, right? This is, about providing an experience for all of your users that is equivalent, right? And then there's an important point in there as well. I think that a lot of people who are talking about accessibility kind of miss is that, you don't have to provide the same experience for all your users. Certainly like your visual users and maybe your deaf users and your blind users, they may have a different experience. Certainly they will in some very philosophical ways, of course, but using your software, just as long as they all have an equivalent experience that gets them through what they need to get through in a non-frustrating and useful way, that is accessibility, and I think that's good enough. Which, in a good way, that kind of opens up possibilities for us as engineers, as designers, as product managers, etc., to think about accessibility as like, well, it may be really hard to provide the same experience for all these users, but if we don't think of it that way, if we just sort of lower the bar, if you will, to an equivalent. And it's important to define equity, right? Like as a truly equal experience, but perhaps different experience. I think that's totally acceptable. So again, we talked about how accessibility is not about ARIA attributes in and of themselves. There are all kinds of ways you can make your software more accessible, especially on the web. And some of these, a lot of engineers are actually excited about for other reasons. And it turns out that these are good for accessibility as well. So of course you can think about things like focus management and tab management, right? For your keyboard users. So your keyboard users are going to be interacting with your website using a keyboard, not a mouse, for either motor reasons or just because they like keyboards. I'm a Linux user. I love working with keyboards. I'm a big fan of keystrokes, Vim, all that stuff. So, you've opened up accessibility for me, right? Of course, there's a lot of visual elements to accessibility, right? Like, people talk about things like high contrast, right? Making it easy for people with visual impairments to read things. And also people who are regular vision, if your contrast ratio isn't high enough, it can be difficult to consume the content, right? You can also do things like provide colorblind modes, even dark mode. I think you can consider a kind of accessibility, maybe a little bit lower priority, but certainly it is making your software more pleasant and accessible to certain kinds of users, right? Things like thinking about animation and motion. So, we love building web apps that are like, a little bit beautiful. They've got like little animations here and flashes here and there, whatnot. And turns out that like, for some users, particularly the ones I think like maybe like people with epilepsy and, these kinds of sort of neurological things, you may want to, for instance, for these kinds of users, you can do this using their preferences. You can detect preferences on the web. You may want to remove animations and just make everything sort of instant, right? With no fade, right? You can also do, this is something that's particularly interesting. So I'm an English speaker who lives in a country that speaks Dutch, right? So you can make your website your software more accessible by providing translations, right? And that doesn't necessarily, you can, of course, actually, hire a translator and translate it and provide it in many languages. But even more simply than that, you can just make sure that your software works well enough with sort of automated translated tools like, Google Translate. There are ways in which you can make software that it doesn't work well with those sort of browser plugins and whatnot. And that would be sort of anti-accessibility in this way. Of course, a lot of engineers are familiar with this kind of idea where you can make your software sort of programmatically accessible, maybe providing an alternative API, or maybe people who are like interested in only the data and not so much like the visual or human experience. You can provide an alternative and equivalent experience for programmatic users, right? Of course, ARIA attributes are a thing. Things like providing alt text on images, putting labels on elements, using all of the sort of labeling and description ARIA attributes are all pretty important, and generally speaking, help users who use screen readers, right? And I also want to make a point about screen readers. There's often a confusing point that the only users who use screen reading software are either blind or partially blind or something like this. But that is definitely not true. By making your software more screen reader friendly, you're making your software more accessible for screen reader users, not necessarily blind and partially blind users, right? And this kind of comes back to when we think about these things, we have to think about it in very concrete and sort of pointed ways, right? Of course, a lot of software engineers, they love to talk about making software performant, but this is actually a kind of an accessibility thing as well. You can imagine users who have like underpowered or low-powered devices, mobile devices, making your website fast, both from like a sort of interaction client performance perspective, as well as, doing things like adding offline support or making it resilient to sort of network failures can help users who are on flaky or remote networks that don't often work or partially work only, part of the time. You can do things like, of course, I don't necessarily, this is probably my least favorite one on the list if you're asking me personally, but you can do things like, support older browsers. In a lot of cases, users actually don't control the software that they use, in the sense that like maybe they're using like a corporate device and they can't upgrade the software. They can't get the latest version of Firefox or, God forbid, Internet Explorer or whatever the case is. Providing an experience for them too may be highly desirable, right? And of course, we talked. I had mentioned this about ARIA attributes already, but there are ARIA attributes do more than just labeling. They also help screen readers sort of understand the state of the application. So, I'm interested in highly interactive applications on the web. Things like recipe websites or blogs where it's like mostly textual content, mostly kind of document-based content is generally by itself pretty accessible. But, if you want to talk about something like even a text editor, right? Or, Google Docs or Gmail or, any of these kind of highly interactive, lots of state management, the content is changing over time. This is where ARIA becomes quite important for these screen readers, because navigating these people through the experience and helping them understand where they are or what has happened on the screen or whatever it is quite tricky. So anyway, I hope that this kind of opened your eyes up to accessibility in general, and like how it's not just about ARIA attributes and what it means to certain people. So at this point, I kind of want to hop into some resources that you could use as a software engineer to make your software more accessible in sort of the least painful way possible. I also want to point out before we look at these things that I had mentioned this before when I was talking about, making your software more accessible for screen readers will make it more accessible for any user who uses a screen reader, not just blind and partially blind users. A lot of these things are, I think, relatively like a lot of expertise is needed, right? And so if you're serious about these things, not only do you need to allocate resources in terms of like, financial or, time into making your software more accessible, but you probably also need someone who's an expert. And you may have to hire for that, which is, I think a little foreign to some companies out there. But it turns out that, very likely that, even if you test your software with a screen reader, if you're not a person who uses a screen reader every day, you probably will use it in a different way than someone who does use it every day. And sort of understanding that nuance and understanding like how screen reader software is used is actually pretty tricky. And there's a lot of different ones out there. It's kind of like browsers where they all have little quirks and differences. And so this is a lot of expertise. However, even if you don't want to go out and hire an expert and someone who like really knows how to use screen reader software and B, like kind of knows all the quirks of them all or whatever, there are some things you can do sort of as a great baseline. And just like accessibility is not a checklist, I also think we can think of it as a spectrum where you can, you can always become sort of more accessible and, making progress on this gradient. All progress is welcome, right? So even if you don't have like a perfect experience for every kind of user, having a pretty good experience for a lot of users is like, you're doing great. So anyway, the first thing I want to look at is this website. It's actually part of the w3.org website. This is the WAR, WAI, ARIA, authoring practices document. This is fantastic. It's actually pretty up to date. And if you really notice what this is a long document of various kinds of experiences that you would want to provide on a website and gives you concrete sort of authoring bullet points of things you need to do when you implement one of these things. And in some cases, optional things that you may want to do. All kinds of things like alerts, buttons, checkboxes, all kinds of stuff that are very, very common in web experiences. And what you want to do in terms of like ARIA attributes you should add, and in terms of maybe things like focus management. So here you can see they're talking about radio groups and how focus should work through those groups. Et cetera, et cetera. And this is a really, really straightforward document. Great resource. I love this resource. And you can always come here and just say, well, I'm making, I don't know, a link's probably a bad example, but I'm making a disclosure on my website. How should this work for screen readers, and what little things should I add to make it a way better experience for these people? The other thing you can do is you can go out, if you're using like a web framework like React or Vue or SolidJS, which has become one of my favorite pieces of software in the last couple of months. You can go out and you can get a sort of component library. And so this is mine. It's called Solid Ally. You don't have to use mine, of course. I think that SolidJS is probably a little too unpopular, that you're probably not using that if you're watching this video, but maybe you are. And if you are, good on you. You can kind of download these things from NPM, and they're usually like a collection of, you can see that these things kind of map to one of the experiences, from this document. So for instance, here's some components that will help you with making, a dialogue, right? So it opens a dialogue, it'll do things like focus management, trapping focus, dealing with sort of inerting the background so that the alert is the only thing that a screen reader user is sort of, the arena that they're playing in, if you will. And a lot of these libraries also don't really have any styling choice. Like for instance, in my case, this is generally, I guess, what we call a headless component library, which means that, it doesn't come with any styling. It's just purely about behavior and sort of these ARIA attributes, these role attributes, for instance. And you can make it look however you want on top of that. I do think that some of the more high-level libraries, like Material UI or whatever, I can't speak to the particulars because I've never used any of them, but I think some of those do also have accessibility in mind. But they generally come with a lot of visuals, which might make them tricky to work with your particular design system, your particular visual flavor for the web application you're working on. So I really, really like these sort of headless libraries. Here's another one. Like this is if you're using React. I can recommend this one. I've had good experiences in the past with Reach UI. Again, it's kind of the same idea where it comes with a collection of maybe some hooks or components that provide, for instance, an alert or a combo box. And they may also have inside the documentation things that you might want to consider beyond using these components, like when and when not to label, or where should I put the focus, and give you APIs to conveniently and easily do those things. Just by putting these kinds of component libraries in your code base, you're already encouraging accessible best practices, but you're also, sort of pushing engineers to think about it and be like, well, if I'm going to put in a combo box, I might come here to read the documentation on how to use the combo box, but then I might see this paragraph in here that tells me about, where I should put the label, or what should the label say, or, these kinds of things. So, and just kind of to drive this point home, here's some code that is in my Solid Ally library. And I just kind of want to show you some of the things that you might consider doing. I think this is part of the dialogue, right? So this is like a modal that comes up on the screen. Of course, it's dealing with labeling that modal and giving the user context as to what the modal's about. But it's also doing things like, sort of hiding the background. You can see that it's using these ARIA hidden attributes, these inert attributes to sort of hide the background. You can see it's dealing with focus management. So I imagine if we take a look at that, so when this dialogue mounts, it's doing things. This is solid, but hopefully this is pretty readable for most users. So when this component becomes alive, right, it's seeing which element has focus when the dialogue starts, and then when the dialogue goes away because the user dismisses it for some reason, it's restoring focus to the place that it was, right? It's dealing with key down events, all kinds of things that you don't really want to write this code by hand if you can. So that's why I recommend these sort of component libraries that give you a lot of abstraction, a lot of best practices out of the box. So that's really all I wanted to talk about. I'm excited by this video. I've been thinking about this stuff for a lot of years, and admittedly, it's not something that I always do about. And so if you're a person out there who's like, I really don't know any of this stuff, that's okay. You can start small. You can start with some of these component libraries. You can start thinking about, adding lint rules to your code base where, all of your image tags have alts on them. All kinds of little tiny steps can add up, and, your knowledge and memorization of all these best practices will grow. And maybe over a long period of time, you'll have a really, really nice, accessible piece of software that lots and lots of people can use and lots of people are accommodated by. Well, I hope this was helpful. Have a great day.